You might go ahead and open up your Bibles back there to Mark chapter 4. Appreciate Ben reading that passage for us, and appreciate the song selections that do go along quite well with the things that I want to look at today. I want to return to the series of lessons looking at Christ and looking at characteristics of Christ. I think there's so much value there, and I hope to continue this series for a number of lessons, just trying to see what we can learn by looking at him. That's the purpose of him being here, is to look at him and learn from him, to learn to be like him. This morning, we're not talking in some ways about being like him, because we're talking about things we are so far removed from. We have no concept of the nature of the power of Jesus. And that's what I want to look at. And here's one display of that in Mark chapter 4, that the winds and the waves obey him, the wind and the sea obey him. And it is said there in verse 41, they became very much afraid when they said this, when they observed the power. We're not going to talk this morning about any revelatory statements. You're not going to have an epiphany and go, oh, I never thought about Christ having power in that way, most likely. And it's certainly not any sort of controversial thing, certainly among believers, to say that Christ is so very powerful. But what I'd like to do is just slow down and contemplate things we already know and see what lessons, maybe the lessons that we can learn from that contemplation are some things that we have not thought of before. Or maybe we have and we just need to think about them again. I want to first just talk about the power of Jesus over nature. That's the nature of the story that we just looked at in Mark chapter 4. If we go back to the Old Testament and we think about God's power over nature, of course, Jesus is God in the flesh. And one of the things that we can do very often as we're looking at the character of who Jesus is we can back up and we can look at the nature of God, and then we can see that sort of illustrated in the life of Christ. We can kind of expand that into the Old Testament, because whatever God does, that's what Jesus does. And whatever Jesus does, that's what God does. And so in this particular, we can get more spelled out the nature of Jesus' power. Of course, John chapter 1 and verse 1 connects us to Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. John tells us that's Jesus. That's him. He's there. And all the things that are created through him. But as we think about this passage in Mark chapter 4, and particularly the nature around us, and we see so many examples of God's control over nature throughout the Old Testament. In Job chapter 37, you'll remember, of course, in the first couple of chapters of Job, that he suffered at the hands of natural disaster, both from the standpoint of the weather, the wind blowing down the structures and killing his children, then the sort of effects of nature on his body as he suffered the boils. In Job chapter 37, and beginning in verse 9, Elihu observes this: out of the south comes the storm, and out of the north the cold. From the breath of God, ice is made, and the expanse of the waters is frozen. Also with moisture he loads the thick cloud. He disperses the cloud of his lightning. It changes direction, turning around by his guidance, that it may do whatever he commands it on the face of the inhabited earth, whether for correction or for his world or for loving kindness. He causes it to happen. Listen to this, O Job. Stand and consider the wonders of God. And he goes on, do you know how God does this? And it sounds very similar, in fact, to some of the things that God will say in his speech just a few chapters later. But he looks around at all the wonders. Here Job has suffered from these things, and instead of shying away from that and saying, oh, no, God doesn't have anything to do with that. And he says, look, God controls it all. He does, and he has that power, absolutely. He doesn't back away from that. God certainly doesn't back away from that. Throughout the Psalms, we see this reiterated. Psalm 29 In Psalm 29 there in verse 3, the voice of the Lord is upon the waters. The God of glory thunders. The Lord is over many waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is majestic. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. Yes, the Lord breaks in pieces the cedars of Lebanon. And so he is described in terms of really, in many cases, a destructive force, like a tornado or a hurricane blowing through. Down in verse 9 of the same chapter, the voice of the Lord makes the deer to calve and strips the forest bare. And in his temple, everything says glory. I know that many of you have seen the after effects of storms, have seen the bark stripped off of trees, massive trees picked up and tossed like spears. I remember driving past Hackleburg after the storm had blown through, and storms had blown through in 2011. And there's a factory there, and it had these very large 6-inch thick concrete walls, sections that had been built with, and they were just tossed around like building blocks. And it's overwhelming, isn't it? And so the psalmist says, you're just getting a sense of the power of God when you see something like that. 135, Psalm 135 and verse 5 beginning. For I know that the Lord is great, and that our Lord is above all gods. Whatever the Lord pleases, he does, in heaven and in earth, and in the seas, in all the deeps. He causes the vapors to ascend from the ends of the earth. Who makes lightnings for the rain? Who brings forth the wind from his treasuries? It is all and every bit him. Over in Psalm 148, finally, and verse 7, praise the Lord from all the earth, sea monsters and all the deeps, fire and hell, snow and clouds, stormy wind, fulfilling his word. I think sometimes we're uncomfortable with assigning that much control to God. And certainly I do think there are ways in which God does take a passive approach in some things. He indicates that, I think, in some other places. But the knowledge that if he is passive, that's what he's choosing to be, he has control over all of it. And there's nothing that can happen that he does not at least decide, I will allow it to happen. It's all under his control. Now come back to Mark chapter 4 then. And what I want you to do is to not just imagine yourself in the boat with these disciples, because I think we're hardly a seafaring people, and maybe you've been out in the water in some difficult situation, some stormy situation, but most of us haven't. We're not in those situations very often. And so it's hard. It's hard to imagine being in that situation. If you lived here in 2011, I know you've been in a situation where you wish the weather would just calm down. I'm certain of that. And even if you weren't here, you've probably been somewhere where you didn't just wish that, you desperately wish that, and your heart is beating, it's racing. You feel like you could die at any moment. The roof could come crashing down on your head, and how desperately you've been in that kind of situation and praying to God for deliverance. There's been a number of those occasions. Alabama is no stranger to tornadoes. Birmingham, where I grew up, has had some very destructive tornadoes, and then Alabama as a whole just kind of got swept through with tornadoes. But I think the most desperate I've ever felt is when we were flying back, Amy and I, about 17 years ago, we were flying back from England, and it was my first time to ever go overseas. And so we're on an international flight, and the plane felt like we were rising up, falling 50 to 70 feet, and dropping on concrete repeatedly. Now, I'd never flown international, and I thought, well, this must be what it's like to fly over the ocean. My wife had flown at least a half a dozen times international, and so I look over at her and it's like, is this normal? And she is gripped onto the seat, tears running down her face. Now I'm worried. I prayed desperate prayers. I did. And I prayed not just desperate prayers of Lord save me. It was, if this is it, receive me into your hands. So, imagine the frightening situation, whatever that looks like. Bring some reality to that, and imagine being able to say to a real person, somebody sitting there who is asleep, unaware of what's going on, you're incredulous at that, you wake him up, what are you going to do? And he just says, be still. And it all just goes away. We think we'd just be like, wow, that was pretty neat. No, that's not what, I think we'd be kind of like this. Who is this? What just happened? Can you imagine having that level of control over all nature? We cannot. I cannot even imagine being in the presence of someone who has that much control over all nature. And of course, it's not just the weather. He has the power to dismiss death with a word. I'm not trying to just throw you into emotional situations, but that's what these are. But imagine being at the kind of funeral where you so desperately wish the person could be back. And imagine Lazarus' sisters, for instance. And when he shows up, and the idea is, what took you so long? If only you had been here. And going to the tomb with him, seeing him weep and assuming, yes, it's over. You could have done something. I've seen you heal people. And him saying, Lazarus, come forth. And then watching your brother walk up out of the tomb. To have a child that has died and to have Jesus come in and say, little girl, get up, arise. To have your own daughter just stand up and start walking around. We read those passages and maybe we read them, they're so familiar that we don't conceive of how overwhelming a sort of thing that would be. To have a man just be able to say, you know what, just get back up. And to do it not even with all of the hysterics that we see with miracles being performed today, just sort of a couple of words. Oh. And then I think something that I frequently overlook is to think of the conception of here is God walking around, God in the flesh walking around, and he is the one who not only created all things, but maintains its existence. If God stops, creation stops. Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 3, he is the radiance of his glory and the exact representation of his nature and upholds all things by the word of his power. He upholds them. He's still keeping it going, as it were. In Colossians chapter 1 and verse 17, he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. I love that idea, and I think that is worthy of contemplation, that he's holding those things together. When will the world end? When he lets go of it. That's when it'll end. And it will stay together so long as he holds it together. Because he wants it to stay together. And we will not be able to destroy, and we will not be able to save outside of what he decides to do with it. Now, we frequently turn to a passage like Mark chapter 4, or any of these passages, where we talk about the power of God, and we speak of it in terms of comforting words. That isn't it wonderful to know that we serve a God who can say to the wind and the sea, be still, and they listen. It is a comforting thing. Isn't it wonderful that we serve the God who has the power over death and disease? And that sort of concept's been mentioned a lot lately. That is marvelous, and it is comforting. But what about when all of that power is there, you know it's there, and what you want is him to use it on your behalf, and he does not. At least not as far as you can tell. That you're crying out, and it's great to be able to look over there and see that he stilled that storm, and he raised that person, and he dismissed that disease. But what about when the disease is on my doorstep, the death is in my family, the storm is coming and crashing down on me right now, and I am crying out to God, and there's no relief. And I know he's got the power. For us, a lot of times the contemplation of the power of God is comforting in some sort of academic way. But when somebody is bearing down under the weight and you go say, God's got power over this, and they're going, I know, what? I don't doubt it. That's the problem, is that he does have power over this, and here it's not going away. Well, there's two sort of reactions, at least on the extremes, that you can have towards that, and they are represented there at the beginning of Job. When he is suffering, and he does know that God has all power. In verse 20 it says, Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head, and he fell on the ground and worshiped. He is suffering, he knows God has the power, and he knows there is nothing else to do but worship. And he said, Naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Over in chapter 2, when things get even worse, his wife says to him, Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. And that is the path that many take in one way or another. They may not just explicitly curse God, but faith begins to wane because faith is based on God using his power for me in the moment the way I want him to. And when he does not, curse him. And Job says, You are so foolish. You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. I don't think that Job is saying that, well, at least I certainly don't think the reality is that God is pursuing Job with adversity in just for adversity's sake. God is in control, and God could keep the adversity from coming, and Job knows that. And at least at this moment, Job has made peace with that. What else can I do? He's God. And by the end, he makes even further peace after he goes down through the valley of sorrow. He comes back up and he sees God. And the peace is not God coming and saying, now I'll take it all away. That comes later. The peace is seeing God and saying, I don't know, and I can't know, except that I know that you're God. And I'll continue to worship you. And so it's sort of like Job starts out here, he goes down through a valley, and he ends up back where he starts, which is you are God, and I will trust in you. And that trust is not based on the fact that you will use that power for me. It's that I know that you have that power. And along with that power, I know you have all wisdom. And I know that you will use it in the ways that are best. Because I'm going to tell you what, if it's me that has the power, I will only make a mess of things. Can you imagine any of us having that degree of power and what a mess we could make with that? We would. I trust him. He's the only one I would trust with that sort of power. Well, one of the reasons that we trust him is because of Jesus. Not the only reason. I think he gives us plenty of reasons throughout the Old Testament. But as we come to the New Testament, we find more reason to trust him with all of that power, because Jesus, with all of that power, comes and lives the life of a man among men who exhibit such lack of control or power over the self, and yet Jesus exhibits total control over the self. And among all the power that he displays, maybe this is the most impressive. Because, first of all, we know that he did not sin. And he stands alone in that. And so when we read Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15, that we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. When we read that, understand read that next to Romans 3:23. All have sinned except one. Except one. In all of history, one man exhibited that control. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 22 likewise says, since you have, chapter 2 and verse 22, speaking of Jesus, it says, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. Committed no sin. To be able to go all the way through life and never utter a word out of place, to never go beyond or stop short, to fully say, not a single sin. He never fell short of the glory of God. He fully exhibited the glory of God. What an impressive feat. But add to that the power to endure what he did. This is some of what we've sung about. We indeed sang about the 10,000 angels that he could call, and we'll look at that in just a moment. But just imagine going through these things with the power that you know that Jesus has. In Matthew chapter 27 and verse 14, Matthew 27 and verse 14, it says, and he did not answer him with regard to even a single charge. So the governor was quite amazed. So, how many times have you been accused of something? You know you didn't do it, and you were able to serenely sit there and listen to accusations. We are hardly able to sit there and listen to legitimate accusations, much less illegitimate accusations. Jesus is the only man who could proclaim actual and total innocence. Most of the time what happens when we're accused, it's not that we're completely innocent. Maybe we're just not as guilty as they're saying, which is a relevant point. But Jesus is guilty of nothing. There's not a single sin he's ever committed. We usually say, well, I could have handled that better. Not the case with Jesus. You see, we give that caveat. We say, now, I know I didn't handle it perfectly, but Jesus could say, I handled it perfectly. No one else could say that. And yet, for all of that ability, not just that, but can you imagine, you know that he has already gone through and given the kinds of responses that just shut people down. I don't have that kind of wisdom. I think I do sometimes. You ever do that? You ever think, you're in a conversation, or maybe you're even thinking back about it, and you think, I tell you what, if I had said this, they would have had nothing to say in response. It's just not true. You ever go into a discussion like that and you think, I've got the perfect response, it's going to shut it down? And then incidentally, it does not. On the internet, it's 600 more comments after that. And every time you think this is going to be it, Jesus actually did shut it down. He went into debate with these, and he's so clever and so wise that these professional orators and teachers come up to him thinking they can trick and trap this rube, and he turns around and he flips their rhetoric right back on them, and there they are, dumbfounded. He could have done it again. And he just sat there and said, no more. Say what you want to say. We're done. That is considerable power. Over in chapter 26 and verse 67, They spat in his face, and they beat him with their fists, and others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is the one who hit you?" There have been times where I have been slapped and hit and maybe even spit on, where I have been helpless to do much of anything in response. Maybe even I tried. You know, you get into a fight with a guy who's bigger than you during school, and maybe you don't fight back, but it's not because you have such considerable restraint. It's because, hey, his arm's as big as my leg. I can't do anything. That's what Jesus had to say in Matthew chapter 5 to Jews who were being oppressed by the Roman soldiers. Don't do anything. Well, duh. We're going to talk about that more in just a minute, but here's Jesus spat upon and slapped and hit with fists. And he has the power with a word to wipe out everyone in the city, in the nation. Anybody who has anything to do with this, in a word, Jesus could lay them flat on their backs. Now, if you had that power, do you think you could sit there and take that? I hardly am able to sit there and take that sort of thing when I know I can't win. What about when I know that I could? Back in chapter 27 again, and verse 26. He released Barabbas for them, but after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. It's one thing, I don't know which is worse, enduring pain or enduring insult. I think for me it might be the insult, because pride is a problem. But to go through the kind of pain that Jesus went through, the first time the scourge hits his back and tears into it, and again, in a moment, he can make it stop. This is not a man who is strapped down and has no choice and just has to deal with the difficulty of being persecuted. He could turn around and say, enough. I'm leaving. And all of that pain, nails being driven into his hands. Can you imagine the first strike and him knowing that he fully has power to stop all of this and to go through it? That is a level of self-control that is hard to wrap my mind around. Philippians chapter 2 reiterates the who's in control in that situation. Being found in appearance as a man, it says, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. It is obedience at that point. It is self-control at that point. It is not the ones who are doing the beating who are in charge. Jesus is. And he's allowing the beating, and he's allowing the crucifixion. And it goes all the way to the point, suffering through that death. And of course, all of that with Matthew chapter 26 and verse 53, that he could have called 12 legions of angels to destroy, indeed, all those who were causing him to suffer, and indeed, as we sang, to destroy the whole world if he had so chosen. And so, why did he do that? Sometimes you'll endure pain because you've got an ailment. Brother Ron Duggar let somebody cut his knee off the other day, which just seems like a strange thing, and put a whole nother one on. I haven't talked to him since then, but Brother Carswell, Harold Carswell, had his replaced, and we've had a few here who've had that done. And none of them say it tickles. It really, really hurts. Why would you do that? So that ultimately things will hurt less. You go through that pain for you. Nothing wrong with that. Would you go through that kind of pain because it would help somebody else? Because it would make them endure less sorrow. Like it gains you nothing. Jesus gains nothing at the cross except you and me. And so, to go through all of that, not because you see, I'm going to get something at the end of this, but rather, Jesus had what he gets at the end of this from his own standpoint. What he doesn't have is us. It's all for you and me. Well, what about his power over me? We can choose our own power. We can choose to rely on our power, or we can choose to rely on his power. And let me just suggest, going back over there to Matthew chapter 5, as I mentioned earlier, if you choose to rely on your power, it is going to be a laughable result. In Matthew chapter 5 there in verse 38, you're familiar, Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. Whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. Now, if they choose not to go by that rule and they say, no, if I am slapped, I will slap in return. That's their power. And what good will that do? Well, it'll either land them in jail or maybe get them killed. Soldier tells me to go with him 1 mile, I'll tell him that that's his own business. And he can't demand things of me. You'll find that he can. And that you have no power to stop him. Jesus says, do you want power? I've got power. And I'll share it with you. Do you want to have power over the man who tells you what to do? You tell him, you'll do even more. And if he says, well, if it's going to be that way, then don't carry my stuff 1 mile. Well, then you've gained power. And if he says, okay, I'll accept your 2 miles. Well, then what you've done is you become the one who offers. And he is no longer the one who takes. Because he can't take what you offer. He puts us in the position of we can't lose when we rely on him. But if it's us, we lose all day. And no matter how powerful you get, somebody else is more powerful. And somebody can always take away your stuff. And somebody can always make you do things you don't want to do. But when we follow him, when we are, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 14, controlled by the love of Christ, then we don't say things anymore like, she made me do this. He makes me so angry. People cannot make you anything when you are his, because you are controlled by his love. And the greatest strength is found when we recognize our own weakness and we boast rather in his strength and not our own. In 2 Corinthians 12, beginning in verse 7, Paul says, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. Concerning this, I implored the Lord 3 times that it might leave me. And he has said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am well contented with weaknesses. Now, just verse 10 is key. We are not talking about boasting about weaknesses in the form of sin. in the form of bad behavior. I just admit that I'm a weak sinner. Well, I may need that. I need to be like the publican. God, be merciful to me, a sinner. But that's not what Paul is talking about here. He defines it for us. I am well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties. And what Paul is saying is, I admit I don't have a lot of strength at all to do much about that. And that's okay. For Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. When we can look around and everybody's saying, what can we do about that? And we're Christians, we're not coming up and saying, I have the solution. Unless what we mean is, the solution is to admit you can't change that. And I'll just trust the only one who can, really. And if he doesn't change that, I assume that's best. And I'll lean on that. And blessed be the name of the Lord. I'll worship him, no matter what's going on. Paul says, I asked for it to go away 3 times. He asked God to use his power. Use your power on my behalf. I know you can do this. God said no. Paul says, that's fine. I'll use that. This will be a strength. This will show who God is, and that is the strongest thing. That is the most powerful thing that we can do. And so that we can have the kind of outlook, the kind of view that looks at the world with all the trouble and all the frustration and difficulty, and still walk around like Paul saying, hey, I'm hopeful. I'm not hopeful that things are going to turn around. Sometimes I am, sometimes I'm not. That's not the point. I'm hopeful I'm going to heaven. I'm hopeful that I'll stand in the presence of this one who is able to display all this power over others, over the world, over himself. And if I will allow him, he will not force it. If I will allow him, power over me. And then I gain strength. It is not weakness to surrender to Christ. It is silly and foolish and ridiculous weakness to go around thinking that you can do anything else and gain. You look like a fool. You speak as one of the foolish ones. And so if you need to yield to his power, you will one day. We've already talked about that. Jason talked about that. You will. But yield to his call instead of falling in terror when you stand before him. If there's any way that we can help you reconcile yourself to him, won't you do that while we stand and while we sing?